The Artistic Vision, a podcast on theology and the arts presented by Creo Arts. This week we have our friend and Asheville resident, Will Revere, who teaches at UNCA Asheville here in town and has devoted his life really to this poem called Piers Plowman, which isn't the most well-known poem, I don't think.
No, it should be.
It should be. It's really fascinating. The Old English may keep some people away from it, but there's modern translations. And that's kind of the bulk of our conversation this week is about this kind of epic poem, Piers Plowman, and what drew Will to the work.
Yeah, and this poem was, I think, in its age, pretty provocative in addressing some cultural issues. And, one of the things we talk about is why didn't, the author, who's actually unknown, why didn't he just write a letter to the editor? Why did he use symbolism? Why did he tell stories to confront some of the current situations that were happening there, exploitation, both from the church, government, using people, stuff like that. And so it's a really great, I think, demonstration of the way that art can be used symbolically to confront some of the issues of our age.
Yeah, and this medieval poem, too, where there's lots of crisis going on.
Mm-hmm.
So if you feel like, who can I trust? Where can I turn for truth? What's the meaning of all this? A medieval poem may be able to help you kind of sort through some of this crisis, this cynicism, in really hopeful and relevant ways. And so I think you'll enjoy this kind of wherever you are as a creator or just somebody struggling with how to make sense.
And Will's love for this poem is contagious. It's contagious.
I love the definition of a good teacher, I think, from Mr. Roger. She says, good teacher just loves its subject in front of others.
Mm-hmm.
Draws us into it. And I think Will is just a good teacher in that way. And so whether this seems like uninteresting to you, I think like a good teacher, Will's going to draw you in.
Mm-hmm.
So,
for sure.
So here he is. All right, welcome to The Artistic Vision, to our old friend, Will Revere. Weren't checking out one, were you?
No. The old friend.
Way back.
So our first question we ask our guests is, what's your beginning with beauty? So were you raised in a home that appreciated literature and the arts? Did you find that resonant in the church? You were raised in the church. How'd you arrive at appreciating the beautiful?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. This is really going to be fun. I'm looking forward to this. I will say I'm a rookie to the podcast game, so if I look down at notes, if I'm like clutching for my notes every now and then, forgive me.
Hey, you're going to fit in really well here.
Oh, good. If you see my eyes wandering. So my mother was an high school English teacher, and I think that had probably something to do with, a love for language that started to develop at some point. I remember her, reading often, and books were always around. And I think for a long time I resisted that turning into a calling, being a teacher in any way. I thought that would be the last thing that I do. And I saw her up late grading papers and things like that. But at some point in college, it kind of snuck up on me. And I think, college kind of snuck up on me, to be honest. But I remember having an experience in a literature class in which a professor gave us a poem. And I think he didn't give us the title of the poem. He didn't give us the author of the poem. Didn't tell us anything about when it was written, any context at all. And we had to do this sort of forensic work on the poem of figuring out what it meant just from the words on the page. And to me, it was just sort of a light switch kind of moment. Like, it was really exhilarating to, sit in a room with other people and yourself kind of silently read what's on the page and try to work out what's happening in something you've never seen before. But in language that's really deliberately used, you can tell, these words are here for a reason. You're trying to figure out what that reason is and what all it might mean. And I just remember that kind of sense of mystery, but of going somewhere and really trying to make sense of words on a page was really exciting to me. And doing it with other people was exciting, because you're sort of in a room where other people care about what you're doing together. I remember that being really impactful. And so that I think I was a bit of a late bloomer in some ways in thinking about those things. But I think what happened was that experience and others sort of drew up, things within me that had been there a long time. So
Yeah. You've given your life, so much of your work, to Piers Plowman, which is a medieval poem with an unknown author. Could you give us a little bit of a summary or history of this poem? And I'm curious, like, what was it about this poem that drew you to it? I mean, you're giving a significant amount of your time and energy to this poem. What is it about this poem that's so attractive?
yeah, my wife would say an overly significant amount of time to this poem. So the question of authorship is really interesting. Actually, he's not totally unknown, but sort of largely is. We've given a name to the poet William Langland, basically from evidence in the poem itself, where he kind of plays on his name. But largely, we don't know much about this poet. In the last version of this poem, so one thing to say about it is that William Langland, the poet, this author that we think wrote Piers Plowman, wrote it in 3 basic long versions. So he's writing from the 1360s to the 1380s. He writes the first long version of the poem in the 1360s, and scholars call it the A-text. And then he spends the next 2 or 3 decades of his life rewriting it. And he's kind of circulating it to some readers, it seems. It's getting out there. But things are happening in the world, and he's reconsidering ways he's put things and kind of positions that he's taken. There's so much happening in the late 14th century in England, and we can talk about that. It's kind of a time of crisis. It's a crisis in the world. If you think about the Black Death is happening starting in the late 1340s. A third to a half of the population of Europe is wiped out. And just think about the massive impacts that would have on the way that you see the world. Mm-hmm. All sorts of people that you know and love are gone. And if you're there, you're left to kind of make your way. Huge economic impacts. So the labor markets get thrown into flux. Workers now have a little more bargaining power with employers because there are fewer of them. And so they're getting really vocal about what they want and, being compensated for what they do. So much so that in 1381, there's what used to be called the Peasants' Revolt takes place, sometimes called the Great Rising, 1381. An archbishop is executed. Documents are destroyed. Groups of folks march on London, they demand conference with the king, an audience with the king, and they kind of see themselves as this like new polity in fellowship with the king. So a lot's happening. There's also a crisis in the church. The Western Schism happens in 1378, where you've got rival popes. One's in Avignon, one's in Rome. They start excommunicating each other. And so there's this sense in the world that Langland really taps into of something is breaking or something is broken. Where can I look to for truth? How can I understand my place in this world? Who to trust? Will, who's the narrator and dreaming persona in the poem, asks a teacher early on, how can I save my soul? Like, given all that's happening, what do I do? So those are some context. So the poem is written in increasingly longer versions, from the A text to the C text. Yeah. And it's revised and rewritten, and it's written in alliterative poetry. So Langland's contemporary Chaucer is writing in poetry that we might recognize a little more familiar, working with syllables and rhyme. The poetic line in Piers Plowman works by stress instead of syllable count, and you'll get these stresses on consonants. So and we can look at a passage in a minute, but the opening of the poem. In the Sommer season, when soft was the sunna, is how it sounds in Middle English. And you get that repetition of the S sound. So it's this like kind of sonically amazing poem that's working by alliteration. And then the last thing to say is it's written as a series of dreams. The poem starts out with someone we learn is called Will, who's a kind of figure for the poet. And he's walking in the Malvern Hills, about 100 miles northwest of London. And he falls asleep and he has a dream. He's sort of weary with walking. He says that he's like clothed like a sheep or like a shepherd. He's a hermit, an unholy hermit. So he's kind of sketchy. We don't know whether or not to trust him. But he falls asleep and he sees a dream, and we can talk about what he sees. But then from there, we just get dream after dream after dream in the poem. So it doesn't have like one single dream frame. One of the coolest things about the poem is that Will wakes up, and then you kind of have an interaction with somebody, and then he falls asleep again, and then everything starts all over again. And often it's when the poem has like written itself into a corner. It's tried to figure something out. It gets really hard, and then it sort of isn't sure where to go, and so Will falls asleep, wakes up, dreams again, and everything starts all over again. So I guess to answer the question, like one of the things or a few of the things that draw me to the poem are how hard it is, how weird and crazy it is. This really old poem that is not at all staid and sort of boring, and you know what to expect. It's always surprising you. And it's really challenging in those ways, but really gripping.
And the narrator's name is Will, too, which probably draws you to it.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, that's probably true.
I wonder, I don't want to kind of condense the poem to its meaning or something, but like as you're talking about the crisis of medieval age, and you kind of think about our modern crisis of meaning and truth and trustworthiness, in what ways do you kind of find its modern reading kind of poignant? Or are there any ways you're like, man, this really helps our modern crisis in some ways?
Yeah, for sure. So anybody who works on Piers Plowman and teaches has to sort of find sneaky ways to teach the poem to students now, because it's much of it's allegorical, it's medieval, it's hard. And one of the ways I've done it is I teach it in this speculative fiction class where we read Piers Plowman next to contemporary speculative fiction, and sort of thinking about possible futures and sometimes like dystopian fiction, things like that. And I think that that's actually a helpful frame to think about Piers and also to think about why we're so attracted to those kinds of stories about the world breaking and sort of how we react and what gets laid bare, what gets revealed when things are falling apart, apparently. And so, yeah, I think it's a really topical poem in that way, and the struggle for meaning in times of crisis, where you are trying to search out who to trust and what to think, and things feel kind of vertiginous and dizzying. But one of the things I love about this poem is that it's not content to just kind of be skeptical or cynical in the face of all those challenges. So, one way to respond to that would be like, yeah, it's crazy. Things are crazy. We don't know who to trust. And so I'm going to rely on myself, and I'm going to, or I'm going to just live a life of, buying things and pleasure and whatever. And Langland's poem won't rest until he's really testing everything. And so I appreciate that. And one of the things I found with students is they sort of hate it and they hate me for a while. And then I've had so many of them say, it's kind of great. So that's a big win for me. Yeah. It's like after weeks of doing it, they go, yeah, you're right. Like, this is great.
Yeah. There's a lot of cultural critique in this, whether it's the church, the way the church is treating the parishioners or the government are taking advantage of people. How does allegory and symbolism work? Why didn't the author just take out a editorial page in the London Times and write about
Yeah.
the struggles that he's having? Why use allegory and symbolism to get his point across?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I guess one of the ways I think about this, so just to narrate a bit of the poem and get us into it,
Yeah.
when we start off in the poem, we start off with this prologue. That's kind of the first vision of the poem. So Will's fallen asleep, and he starts to tell us what he sees. And he sees a tower of truth on one side, and he sees a dale or a dungeon of death on another side, and in between is what he calls a fair field full of folk. So there's that alliteration again. Sort of all the people in the world. He imagined. If you have seen pictures of Malvern Hills, it's great to imagine that particular place because it's a great place to walk. It's really beautiful, but it looks down on kind of human civilization below. And if you've ever gone to a high point and looked down, you kind of have this different perspective on, the rat race and what things look like when you're in it versus when you can kind of get some distance. So Will is, seeing his world and all the busyness of it, and he sees, people working and people praying and people buying and selling and all these kinds of things. So there's a lot that happens in the prologue that fills in this picture of Will's world. And we do get this sense, like you're saying, Gary, of a kind of critical edge on something's not right in this world, or maybe a lot of things aren't right. People are taking advantage of other people. There's exploitation happening. And then in Passus 1, so the poem is broken up into chapters that are called passus, which is a Latin word that means step. And so the first step of the poem, we get this teacher who shows up. We don't know anything about her, but she seems to kind of descend from heaven. And she says, Will, do you see all these people in the world? How busy they are about the maze. If they have worship in this world, they will know better. Of any other heaven than here, they have no care. They don't care about any other heaven than here. And so they start talking, and then she says, do you know who I am? And he says, no. And it's eventually revealed that this is a figure called Holy Church. And she's going to try to explain what Will has seen. But I think it's so fascinating that Will doesn't know who she is when he first meets her. So even the church is sort of a question from the start in the poem. Mm-hmm. Like, how do I recognize, like, where the church is, what the church teaches, But, and she's a great teacher. She has some beautiful lines in the poem. But the other thing that this does is kind of why do allegory and poetry and not write an op-ed, is that if Will starts the poem as this like fire-breathing critic where he's going to look out on all this injustice in the world and sort of, get angry about it, Holy Church like pulls him back and asks him, kind of shows him his own limitations. She makes fun of him a little bit. She's like, she calls him a doted doff, like you're sort of dunce. And she's like, don't you remember all this stuff that you were supposed to learn when you were young? And why don't you know who I am? And Will keeps saying, there's this phrase in the poem, kind knowing, keen to knowing. And he says, I have no kind knowing. Teach me more. I don't know. And so what she does is she like brings him to a place kind of beyond satire and criticism. And she says, just hang on a minute, right? Like your initial impulse is to just see the world critically. But I love about this poem that it won't even let you do that. Like you can't just start from a place of critique. So she pulls him back to a place of kind of what can you affirm? What is it that you love? And that gets the poem going in this complicated way. And I think you can only do that narratively, and for Langland, like allegorically, where you're calling to mind all these huge important ideas and concepts and institutions, like a speaking person called Holy Church. And so you get to have these really great interactions.
I think even your students' reactions with kind of it growing on them is a good example of the way symbolism works. Mm-hmm. Like you starts with your own assumptions that you bring to it. You're looking at this thing
Yeah.
that feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar, and all of a sudden you find yourself sort of in the middle of it and challenged by it. I think
Right.
good art does that, right? It doesn't just hand you something, it draws you into participation. I think that sounds like that this poem does that beautifully.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, it won't, it requires a lot of you. You know, it's a poem in part about work, is at the center of the poem is this kind of mysterious hero called Piers, the plowman, who's just like a lowly worker. And we can talk about him, but he's maybe the most complicated kind of allegorical figural figure in the poem, because he's both literally just a medieval plowman, and then eventually he takes on this kind of Christological importance and becomes a figure of Christ and of Saint Peter and of the Pope and a whole number of things. But he's constantly appearing and disappearing in the poem. So one of the ways the poem works is, you know, Piers shows up and gives you some authoritative teaching, and then Will turns around and tries to find him, and he's gone. The poem is in many ways about the virtue of work, and it requires a lot of work from us as interpreters.
Do you have a favorite passage you could share with us that maybe like could probably not summarize some of these things, but just one that you're kind of regularly drawn to?
Yeah, I knew you guys were going to ask about passages, or you were going to ask for a passage, and so I think I sent you like 5 or 6. That's good, which was me reining it in, because there's just so much that's good. But I sent you a few. I mean,
You can do a couple of them.
you can do a couple. Okay, yeah. I mean, if you want to hear a little bit of it? In Middle English, we could do that. We could do the start, and then we could like look at another passage.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so there are a number of great modern translations of the poem, but you know, it's written in this this kind of English that sounds weird to us and has different vowel sounds and sort of worked a little different grammatically. So, you know, if you think of Shakespeare as actually modern English, which usually people don't. By the time we're in Shakespeare, we're actually in modern English, but Middle English is an earlier version. So I love doing the original with students because it sort of makes our own language weird for a while, which can be really useful. So it sounds something like this. This is the opening of the poem. In a summer season, when soft was the sun, I shoop me into shrewd as I a shape were. In abbot as an hermit, on Harley of Werkas, went forth in the world, wanderers to hear. And say many sellers and sell cool thingers, ac on a May morning on Malvern hullas, maybe fell for to sleep, for weariness of walked. And in a lund as I lay, leaned I, and slept, and merveilleseliche me mette, as I may yo telle. All the wealth of the world, and the woe both, winking, as it were, witterliche, I see it, of truth and treacherie, treason and guile, all I saw sleeping, as I shall yo telle. So that's the opening, like, 12 lines.
It's beautiful.
You can kind of hear some of that. Yeah. Hear some of the alliteration there. And it's a beautiful form of poem that sort of has movement to it, just in working with those stresses. So you can pack in pretty much any number of syllables you want. It's not quantitative in that way. It's just about where those stresses fall, which also gives it a way of kind of imitating ordinary speech, which works more by stress than syllable count. So I love that. And it's a kind of native English form of poetry. So, you know, Beowulf, for example, which is in Old English, Anglo-Saxon, also works by that kind of alliteration. So Langland's using this like native English form. But yeah, maybe we could just read. This is a short passage. This is from Holy Church, that first teacher that I mentioned. And among the things that she teaches Will is he asks, how can I save my soul? And then he asks her kind of, where is truth? What is truth? How do I find it? And so she starts to give a gloss on what truth is and who truth is, which is a name for God in the poem. And in the course of doing that, she she gives the poem's first account of the incarnation. So she gives this little lyric, which is a beautiful image, I think, of the incarnation. So this is in the modern translation. For truth counts love, sin's best antivenom, and the sovereign of salves for the body and soul. Love is the plant of peace, most precious its virtues. Heaven could not hold it, so heavy it first seemed, till it begat itself of earth. Never was leaf upon linden lighter thereafter, as when it had taken flesh and blood form. Then it was light and piercing as the point of a needle. There's no armor or high wall can block it. So this image of the incarnation as this sort of heavy plant that is so sort of weighty that heaven itself can't contain it. And it's got to sort of take earth up into it and into its roots, as I think just kind of a beautiful and a sort of tangled image of the incarnation.
Along these lines, I think, of Piers Plowman and its work on us, is that I've heard that literature or poetry has the ability to make us more virtuous people, or at least can play a part in shaping virtue. And I've heard kind of both sides, like, no, it doesn't, it's not supposed to, and absolutely it does. What's kind of your take on the role of literature in forming people of virtue?
Yeah, I feel like of two minds about it. I mean, it's I really want to believe that's true, because that's why I, do what I do. Mm-hmm. But I'll just say the skeptical side first. So the skeptical side would be something like, academic training or whatever. There's no straight line between that and being virtuous, which I think is actually good news, because there could be kind of exclusive versions of that. Like, you got to read the right books, you got to go to the right school or whatever to be virtuous, or to have certain credentials or something, which we can't think that. Sometimes that seems to be like the common sense, but that's got problems. So if literature means like a kind of body of knowledge that leads to virtue in that sense, I think that can't be right. But I think at its best, literature can be one among other things, like crafts, that can train our attention. This is how I think about the good of what we do when we read, and when we read poems, when we watch films, when we look at art. It can make us attend really closely to the world in a way that, I'm thinking of, you guys probably know, like Iris Murdoch's account of attention and Simone Weil, and this idea of like a just and loving gaze at something that Murdoch compares to learning a foreign language, which is, if you've ever had that experience, it's like really hard and frustrating to stop thinking in your own native language and to try to put your thoughts into this other form. So much so that a lot of people get off the train after a little while. Like, I've done that, where you just go, I don't want to do this anymore. And, or even like learning math, another kind of language or something. So attention in that sense of like art can make us look outside of ourselves and see the world differently, kind of bracket our own stuff and get past, illusions and self-involved fantasies and that sort of thing. It can kind of make the world strange in that way. And then, positively, I think we've probably all had this experience. This goes back to me in that, lit class. When you see words together in such a way that gives you that sense of recognition, like, yeah, that's what I've always thought. I haven't quite known how to put it, but that is so right. That's such a common, readerly experience. Or even, Gary, you might, I don't know if you think this is right, in looking at an image, if you see an image and you think, that's kind of how I've been trying to see it. And that's just this like amazing gift of art, to be able to articulate not what an individual artist thinks so much as I'm trying to articulate this common thing that someone else can look at and say, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a powerful function of art.
Nice. So you teach literature. You have an advanced degree in literature, obviously, but you also have an advanced degree in religion. I was curious to hear a little bit about your interest in the intersection between those two things.
Yeah, I mean, it's ongoing for me to try to figure out how those worlds come together. But, just in terms of being in different programs, I think I always had this sense that there was all this literature I wanted to study, that much of it was pre-modern, and so much of it was so engaged with theology and philosophy in these like really rigorous ways. So it was a really attractive idea to me to think that literature thinks, that it's not just kind of about creating images, but that creating of images and metaphor is itself a kind of thinking, and that it's interacting with this whole body of knowledge over here and what all these theologians and philosophers are talking about. And so I felt like there's all this stuff I want to know, and it's on both sides, and I want to see how they can talk to each other. And also, why is it that theologians write treatises and not poems? So what difference does form make to what it would be to have a theological thought, Yeah. And so I think those are just ongoing questions, and I love trying to kind of bring those worlds together, see how they overlap. And in some ways, in modern life, we've like siloed all these different disciplines. Mm-hmm. So it was really attractive to me to think about, for a poet like Langland, they weren't separate. None of this stuff was separate. It was all in the same place. And so I love that idea of like a wholeness or an integrity, that I don't have to now put on this hat and now put on this hat. Like it's all right there.
Good.
What would you say have been the 4 or 5 books that have shaped your thinking?
Let's do 20. Top 20.
Oh, no. That's really hard. You didn't give me that one beforehand. I mean,
like maybe not.
What if I said Piers Plowman?
Yeah,
there you go.
That's kind of
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
as people are thinking about thinking symbolically or integratively or wholly, and wanting their lives to reflect more virtue or love or truth, what are some resources you could point to?
Well, I mentioned that Iris Murdoch book, The Sovereignty of Good, right? Yeah, The Sovereignty of Good. And which, I didn't read till graduate school, but it's a fairly short book. And I think Murdoch kind of thinks of herself as a latter-day Platonist in some ways, but she's got some really wise, and she's got some really wise reflections on art and fiction and virtue, actually, in that book. And she's thinking around that idea of attention quite a bit, and I find that really useful. So that would be one I would say that I think any artist could really benefit from reading and thinking through. And the work of Simone Weil, Murdoch is thinking with this notion of attention out of Simone Weil's work. She wrote that essay on the usefulness of school studies or something like that, where she thinks about the notion of like any kind of craft that you're dedicating yourself to, that's taking you out of yourself, that's demanding something from you. And that idea of attention as attendere, that like this like stretching of yourself towards something for a while, they thinks a kind of prayer, that there's like an integrity in that will repay you no matter what it is that you're attending to. So there's an integrity in that. So I think any artist probably could resonate with that. Like you've got to sit with something for a long time. So much so, like if you've ever written something, I know you have just written a book, you get to a place where you're sort of sick of it and you just want to get rid of it. But then, maybe give it a few months and you look back and you go, okay, there was worth in that effort, Those are two that come to mind. Those were not like books I read early that shaped me, but I think they resonate with what we've been talking about.
That's great. All right, we're at time, I think, so we'll give you the last word. what's something you want to share to listeners who are listening who are Christian artists?
Yeah, I did think about this question when you sent it to me, and I guess the first thought I have is the rest of us would probably benefit if you're brave. So to be brave and to like look at the difficulty of human life and show us that, and not pull punches. Kind of not get caught up too much in your own sort of how you'll be received or like what's fashionable or what you think people need to hear even, but to kind of do that thing that happens when you pay attention to something and see where it leads. I think that we all need that, and we need that kind of art that surprises us because it doesn't sort of take the cheap options. Piers Plowman, as I said before, like it works really hard. It tries out all these different answers to the questions that it asks, and it pushes it to the very end. And sometimes it gets to a place where it then rejects something that it had previously held on to really closely. And it says, I got to try something else. That doesn't work. That can't be right. And I think that kind of art inspires trust, because if I'm consuming that art and I watch you do that, I think I want to go with you where you're going to take me, because you're trying to see where stuff goes. You're not pulling punches. So yeah, I would say be brave and show us the ways that our imagination is full of these like little idolatries that we need to break out of and to see the world more fully.
That's a good word. That's a good word. Appreciate it. Well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks, y'all. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah. We'll see you soon. Fellow Asheville native.
Right. All right.